These are the beginnings of the Tripana Salt Flats, for lack of a better term, but where they, from olden times, very old times, perhaps going back before the Phoenicians, but certainly at its peak with the Spanish Crown's mandate that this place be the prime developer and producer of salt, salt has been produced, and the seawater gets pumped in, and then these basins, if you will, are allowed to dry up, and the salt harvested and then ground up. And I'm thinking that what we're seeing in the distance there is the stub tower, the base tower of a windmill. Just has that look about it. And if I go further this way, the same tower but with the cone that would have held the mechanism for the pivoting windmill. We'll see more of that, but just as a primer. And notice here you can see how they have laid out ditches, if you will, or channels to get water from one basin to another, and perhaps even to dry one basin from another. See from these white hoses that modern technology has perhaps provided a more efficient way of doing that. We'll see a whole lot more of this in the next hour or so. And almost from the port area that I left, where my B&B is, was a wide walkway, and then from down there is this dedicated bike path and pedestrian path. So our first close-up look, this building, probably the main storage and whatever was involved in the processing of it. There our windmill. It's interesting, I've seen a number of windmills in Eastern Europe, Romania. Access door into the inner workings. Hey, we could have been here and listening to this thing turn and the machinery grinding, making its primitive noises, if you will. This is what supported it, these vast flats. I wonder if those are piles of the old salt, or even the new salt for that matter. Some kind of quay here, perhaps, which is part of the I think the windmill was also used for pumping water in and out of this whole system. Those skeletons were covered with a fabric so that you had a legitimate sail. And then those ropes out at the end of that pivot point to keep the wind from forcing the sails back and putting too much stress on the sail spars. And this is a large reserve now, it's all preserved. Some of it's inaccessible. It's also for animals and birds, possibly. It's a flyway and migratory center. But there are very few trees, if any, out there because trees block and slow down the wind. So we'll turn right here and go to the Saline, and then we'll return and go to the Museo delle Saline. So we're right here, and we're going to wander in here a little ways and look around, then we're going to quickly come back and go back down this way and ultimately try to get to this complex right in here, which was suggested, I believe, by Sarah at the bike shop. And from there we may be able to negotiate our way over to the Museo without going back out to the road. I'll pan around, just making observations as I go, since I don't know much about what I'm looking at. But even looking towards the sea, you can see off in the distance numbers of towers that remain, although their windmills are now gone. Not only has this area been commercialized and industrialized in 1961 to modern mechanics, and we'll see some of those salt ponds that reflect that, I think. But also there's somewhere in the midst of all this that we won't be able to identify was a Muslim tower that used wooden blades. There's the tower we could see from a distance at the road. And here, of course, I'm panning over this large, fairly large canal, relatively speaking, with well-made banks. And there out in the middle are two more towers with the remnants of windmills hanging precariously on them. I think we'll take a closer look right now. But some of these towers were also used simply to move water through these initial ponds from the sea into the interior ponds using what they called the Spira Archimedes. And I believe, if I recall, Archimedes had developed a pump using a spiral. In other words, a spiral in the tube rotated will draw water up or through it. That's what they were. Guessing that what we're walking on is a mix of probably some kind of gravel that these ponds have been dug out of and the salt. And these may even be chunks of salt. Let's see if we can see. No, it's not. It's limestone of some sort. These are probably the more modern high walls, so they can perhaps pump in more water and thus have more salt to both drop down and precipitate out as the wind blows across them. And then here are cement quay, probably trucks or other vehicles go down in and literally pull out the plates of salt, if you will, and haul them over to the current factory. In the old days, men in wagons probably would have hauled them to the windmill grinding stations. It's interesting to see this large complex, and then remember the not as large, but certainly as complex, if not even more so, and certainly more primitive in Peru that had been used for hundreds, if not thousands of years in the Machu Picchu area. Here what we would call a pillbox, perhaps built by we Americans, perhaps indicated by the flag, but otherwise I can't figure out what it means. My Pui Piu War referred to the 1915-1918 war. Perhaps this is a shrine to those who died on these fields. Wasn't aware the war was fought here. Apparently that's the flywheel there. Here's a picture of how it works. Here's that red cone that we can see. There's some gearing up above. Here's what's that we're looking at right now is right in here. And that's apparently the flywheel down there. Now what powers that, I don't know. Unless it's water somehow. So here's the gearing from the power from the wind, brings it to this gear, taking it down the shaft. Not sure what this is other than maybe a stabilizing device. And then here, the device that turns this, which may be either grinds the salt or pumps water. These perhaps casks for carrying the salt? Maybe for flattening it out. He'll explain all of it, I'm sure. Imagine the poor bastards that had to haul that around this hot sun. Another view, and then this may be that Archimedes spiral here that pumped it from that lower level up and out into this higher level. So we're up on top of the processing building at Museo di Saline. I'll just pan about. This is a private family operation. come from every direction, not just the Sirocco from Africa. Also, one of the benefits of Tripani versus any other place is the lack of the ocean-type waves that Palermo can get on the Mediterranean Sea. I'll add a little bit that the gentleman who gave the tour provides. This is the mud that is on the bottom underneath the salt, and when it's compacted, apparently it gets dark, and that increases the evaporation of the sun. Put about 200 kilos of rock on this thing, and then two men hauled it back and forth across the salt pans. This barrel actually was used to haul water for the purpose of cleaning any mud that was inadvertently shoveled up with the salt. Here's a little model showing a typical operation. It goes through several levels of water with salt in it that continually increases the percentage of salt until it gets down to a relatively high percentage of like 20-25%, and then they start just bringing in layers of water, let it evaporate, then bring in the next layer, etc., etc. It was one of two sets of grinding stones, and you'll notice that it used the rock like this, which is a limestone with shells in it, because apparently that did not infuse the salt with particles of stone. When you've got stone rubbing against stone, regular stone rubbing against regular stone, as opposed to this limestone. And then there was another wheel here, similarly positioned, that ground the salt even finer. This was a modern version of the machine, but unfortunately it's prey to corrosion, as you can see from the highly corrosive salt. So in a few years it would destroy this. So they ultimately just end up using it for grain. This is the example, the large version of Archimedes' screw. I think this is fascinating to look at. I'm sure we can get a drawing on the internet, but here you get to see the real thing. Notice the blades in there. How this was made is interesting. The craftsmanship behind making this tubular, that it was a very sophisticated version of the barrel maker's trade. It saved me the trouble of going on the internet. We can see a drawing of it. A smaller version of Archimedes' wheel. Still a smaller one. This one, of course, could be turned by hand, and it may just be for a smaller pond, if you will. Now, the number of these that are filled in with boards or with material determined how much pressure it had. These teeth are made from a fruit wood of some sort, hard as a rock, but they could be replaced if they broke, as you can see, and you've seen this before, this technology. Out comes this pin. Here they're metal, but they could have been wood, and you hammer a new one in and lock this in. Sometimes they were held by wedges. Windmills' arms went in here. How heavily banded with steel this was. Another one would have been here to hold this relatively fragile wood together with the tremendous forces the wind puts on that. Cantilevering of those entire wings out into the space. Combination of a gear made out of wood and metal. And again, I saw the same thing used for non-salt purposes in Romania's Bucharest museum of 500 acres outside of town. Second or third biggest one in the world. Perhaps for catching fish, because one of the byproducts of this, the pools, as they moved water from one to another, particularly from the initial pond, the fish that were trapped in there, the small ones they left. The big ones they just caught by hand and had a secondary business. If I thought climbing up to the top of that mountain was difficult, imagine working in the hot August sun, as these men had to. Not only that, what did it do to your lungs? What did it do to your feet? Notice how it's hauled by hand. Ironical how that looks like snow and seems counterintuitive or contradictory to see men in their shorts working in snow, but of course it's salt. Just above my thumb where it says number 1, you can see Museo de Sal. We're going to try to ride my bike up along that red line that goes from lower left to upper right from that one up to the Saline Calcara, if I can, and then negotiate my way up to that long street that comes out along where that water is, if I can. The thing I would guess is if I fall and die out there, I'll be well tickled by the time they find me, perhaps. Say that's a joke or some god will think it's something he has to act on. It's interesting how I can hear the wind whistling through those skeleton spars, but imagine what it would be like if the wind were forcing them to turn and that wooden heavy mechanism were grinding and roaring away inside the building. It'd be something entirely different. Seeing that these are just piles of protected rough salt, maybe with some mud, that's not able to be processed at this point for some reason. And back there, I give you an idea of how strongly this wind blows. In the spring, apparently, now. What you can see is that grain. And then the foliage and flowers and trees nearby, olive trees, I think. I drove into a small village, like 10 houses, and the man said I couldn't go to Calacara, but as I drove further along the road that I returned to, I came to a sign in English that said, yes, it's a reserve, but in bicycle or foot you can go. Here's where I want to go, but I can't get access. Here's another gate, but it's closed up, another operation we're looking at. And probably they're redundant, so it's no big deal if I don't, but always try. Here you can see a modern rolling machine. It does more quicker. And those raised banks there may be what the first filling is, and then these lower ones are when they want it to be thinner amounts of water to start building up the layers of salt. So I'm guessing that's salt, and that those piles are salt waiting to be processed someday. And there in the distance, coming into view is where I wanted to go. No big deal, it's probably going to be more of the same, and the museum is probably the best you're going to get of the original. View of the shoreline. It looks like a cloud or a fog coming in. Is a tribute to sailors lost at sea. Here's a little shrine over here with a picture of, or a statue of either a saint or a sailor. But notice there's also a little box in the upper right-hand corner that you can, with a severe lock on it, that you can put donations in. An interesting restaurant because you eat in these little individual rooms. like this, and then you can see from one room to another room, which is kind of interesting. Killer pizza at Colvino Pizzeria, in business since 1946. Can you believe it? It's an interesting restaurant because you eat in these little individual rooms like this, and then you can see from one room to another room, which is kind of interesting. Grazie.